Okay. My name is Aziz Choudry. I am one of the people who is involved in a project called Bilaterals.org, which is a website, collaborative website, which is set up to help to map and also resource the spread of bilateral free trade and investment agreements across the world. I'm also involved with a New Zealand-based organisation and activist group called GATT Watchdog, which has been fighting against WTO, MAI, Multilateral Agreement on Investment, APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and now bilateral free trade and investment agreements. And I guess really what we've seen in the last few years has been a spread of these bilateral agreements, whether they're being promoted by the US or whether they're being promoted by the European Union or even among countries in the South, where you have, for example, some countries like Thailand that seem to be positioning themselves, the governments seem to be positioning themselves to be kind of a hub for a lot of these agreements, in the hope, looking through a neoliberal lens, that they will get some kind of benefit from it. We have to move. Important to see that these agreements, while they're very important to understand economically, are not just about economics, and they're certainly not just about trade. We saw in the Uruguay round of the GATT, which set up the World Trade Organization, a vast expansion of what was considered to be international trade issues. We saw agriculture come in, we saw services come in, like essential services like water, energy, and the agenda was to privatise essentially, and to, as transnational corporations were expanding and diversifying, to find ways that they could essentially come to control and access natural resources and privatise and commodify everything, including life itself, which we can see very clearly coming through intellectual property rights agreements at the multilateral, regional and bilateral level. And one of the things that's happening with the bilateral deals is that they go much further and faster than has been happening with the WTO talks and with regional initiatives. We can also see very clear links between militarism, the so-called US war on terror, and the way that the US decides who it's going to have an FTA with. So it wants to show, for example, that the US is not anti-Muslim by having an agreement with Morocco, an FTA with Morocco. Now it's in the process of signing individual FTAs with the Gulf countries, and, for example, a provision in these, or a conditionality of these agreements, is that those Gulf countries that sign an FTA with the US must lift their boycott of Israeli goods at a time that Israel is carrying out atrocities in Lebanon and in Palestine, and given the sort of the feelings and concerns of many people around the world about what's going on, we can see that this agenda goes hand in hand with, on the one hand you have the US backing Israel militarily, on the other hand you have it supporting it in the economic international trade arena by essentially forcing countries that have tried to have a boycott of Israeli goods to open up to Israeli goods. We can see that governments that have been allies in the so-called war on terror in other parts of the world, like Australia being supposedly rewarded with an FTA, and also with Thailand. And I think a really key part of all of these agreements is also investment, because one of the big dangers that people saw in the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, Mexico and the US was the possibility for the first real time of a very important and very worrying power that corporations could essentially sue, or could, I mean, suing is not exactly the right legal term, but they can launch a complaint against the government for any act or omission that that government may have taken, which they claim has caused them a loss of profit or some negative impact. And we've seen this has opened the door for many different kinds of corporations suing or taking complaints under NAFTA. But we're also seeing now many bilateral investment agreements being used. For example, in the case of Argentina, we can see where water companies, mainly from Europe, have used, Europe and the US, have used bilateral investment treaties with Argentina to try to stop Argentinian government from regulating in any way in the water sector. And of course, the privatisation of water in Argentina came as part of World Bank, IMF structural adjustment programs. And so we can see another way in which these investment and trade agreements lock in economic so-called reforms or neoliberal policies, and they do so in a way through the agreements themselves and through the investor-state disputes in a very secretive manner, so that ordinary people don't even know that, well, they may not even know that these agreements exist because they're very low profile compared to the WTO. But in the case, for example, of an investor-state dispute between a corporation and a country, people will not know the details of what's going on because the arbitration essentially happens in secret. It's kind of like a privatisation of commercial justice. And so now with the situation at the WTO, now it's very clear that there will be no agreement by the end of the year. The talks are really struggling. They've been struggling for some time. And no doubt there's a lot of behind the doors bullying and brinkmanship that is happening at the WTO to try to continue to force the talks. On the other hand, the failure of the WTO to be able to sort of agree or to come to some kind of what looks like an agreement is quite a useful thing for many of the countries which are pursuing bilateral and regional and sub-regional deals, because these deals have the potential to really divide and rule. You can see very clearly that this is the US agenda after the failure, for example, of the free trade area of the Americas to really make much progress in Miami 3 years ago. Instantly we saw Robert Zoellick, the then US trade representative, talking about the importance of these bilateral deals. We saw the same thing after Cancun when Zoellick said there are some countries that are can do, there are some countries that won't do when it comes down to agreeing with the US. It's a bit like their war on terror, you're either with us or against us, the same thing in economic and free trade. And so the bilateral deals are really becoming more and more the focus of attention for the big powers, and so too for movements, for people's movements. We can see in Korea, we can see in Thailand, we can also see in many countries of Latin America very strong resistance growing to these bilateral deals. And what we need to do is to make sure that we can really understand how it is what it is that's behind these deals, bearing in mind both the global and the local geopolitical situation, and also looking at our strategies and trying to understand, well, okay, we've been fighting the WTO for some years now. What can we learn from those struggles? We've been fighting World Bank and IMF for some years now. What can we learn from those struggles? And what can we also learn from the struggles of other movements in different countries that have been specifically fighting against bilateral agreements? And we really need to do, a lot of work to be able to build on our learnings from those different struggles in order to be able to make these bilateral agreements a very, very rough and very, very tough ride, so that these agreements, these neoliberal policies get confronted and challenged, and ultimately we need to defeat them. And so this is, I think, part of a bigger struggle against neoliberalism, whether it's fighting at the state level, whether it's fighting at the World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank level, the WTO or the regional level. All of those things interconnect. And so I think that that's some of the work that we have to do. Because really, when we look now at this divide and rule bilateral process, it's really nothing but, and indeed the whole neoliberal agenda, it's really nothing but just the latest wave of colonisation, the same mentality that we saw with the British and other European powers. We can now see with the European Union's approach to its old colonies through trying to get them to become WTO consistent through forcing and locking in economic reforms through bilateral and ultimately a bigger regional set of agreements. And we can see that very clearly with the US and very, very clearly with the US in terms of what it wants to do in Latin America, which it essentially sees as being its backdoor source of natural resources. We can see more and more the links also between the oil issue and fuel issue and obviously environmental concerns, and also these free trade agreements, how they're being sewn up between a country that maybe has some problems in terms of its access to oil and gas and so on and water, and countries that have more of those resources. And so essentially the pattern and the kind of the framework for these agreements is still a very kind of colonial exploitative model, and that needs to be challenged. It needs to be delegitimized, and it needs to be defeated.
All right.
Is that okay?
I have some more questions.
Oh yeah. Well, no. If you want to do,
okay.
hang on. Let me just see how we're doing for time. I just because I'm one of the organisers, I have to be sort of in there.
Yeah,
so
right.
yeah. So
just one more
yeah,
question.
sure.
So what aspect are you focusing on when you see the Korea-US FTA and anti-movement about FTA in Korea? Specifically.
Aspect. How do you mean?
I mean, what are you interested in? You know, some situation in Korea in terms of FTA.
Okay. I mean, I think one of the really positive things about the people's struggle in Korea is that there was an understanding about bilateral agreements in Korea among some of the movements a long time ago, like relatively. At least, you know, this is something that since the economic crisis, at least, people have been talking about. And I think that's really important because you know, in some ways, that has been a big. It's been important just that we know that there are people who are mobilising specifically about those issues. I think that the Korean struggle around culture and film and arts and the impact of the FTA on that is something too that seems to have, while I mean, I look at it from the outside in the sense that I'm not part of the movement in Korea in terms of knowing the internal dynamics. I think it's a really important issue, and it's one that certainly comes up a lot in conversation with people. I remember, you know, I had a conversation with people in Vietnam about 3 or 4 years ago in relation to the bilateral trade agreement they had with the US, and certainly culture and the impact of the Hollywoodization of culture, and also at a regional level, their concerns about, for example, actually Korean and other sort of dominant cultural industries being able to penetrate Vietnam. That's certainly an issue that you know, some people have been fighting. I know in Morocco that's also been a case, but having said that, I think that has been a focus that's an interesting focus that I think other people in other countries may want to look at some more, because it's been in some of the anti-FTA mobilisations, but it's been absent in others. And I think there are certainly some things that can probably be learnt from the Korean experience in that sense, in terms of working with cultural workers and particularly independent filmmakers, musicians, and so on in other countries that are facing bilateral agreements. And I think in some ways there's a commonality in terms of the concerns that Korean farmers have with the neoliberal agreements, whether it's with the Korea-Chile agreement or whether it's with the US bilateral, that concern, that impact of essentially undermining food sovereignty And in the first place, I mean, one has to question why agriculture is an international trade issue after so many years of it being a domestic issue. And of course the reason is because agribusiness corporations, particularly the ones in the US and the EU, wanted it there because they had to do something with their surpluses, and they wanted new markets, and they wanted ultimately too to be able to control the food resources in the world. So I think, and also, I mean, obviously the labour movement in terms of KCTU and workers concerned about those impacts in Korea. I think that's also, another area where it seems like there is a strong understanding and resistance to the FTA. How that then translates in Korea to alternatives to the neoliberal agenda, I don't know, but I would imagine that there is debates about how then to come up with alternatives at that national level, both to resist the US FTA and other FTAs as well that Korea's government is planning to sign, but also then through that, in that resistance, to build alternatives. I think one other thing, I guess, one interesting question or issue that I, as an outsider, I look at the Korea-US agreement and wonder about is the whole question of North and South Korea too, because one of the things that's very clear about the bilateral free trade agreements, as with other free trade and investment agreements, is that they lock in economic reforms, but they also have really targeted former communist countries now. Okay, so North Korea is still, nominally it's a communist country, but in the case of many of the countries like Vietnam, of Laos, of the Central Asian republics, of Eastern Europe, it's very explicit if you look at the EU and the US and indeed other countries that are making these deals, that essentially these free trade agreements, these investment agreements, are kind of like badges to show that these countries are not communist anymore, and they're going to be part of the wonderful, supposedly, global free market. And I think how this issue plays out in the talks is going to be very interesting. And I don't know what the position is of the people's movements. I know there's, the US is saying, for example, that it will not accept goods that are made in Kaesong through the FTA with Korea. But then I also wonder what the national government in Korea, its agenda is in relation to reunification, and particularly the South Korean capitalists who might see possibilities to use some leverage with these international agreements to also be able to set up investments or so-called investments to be able to exploit essentially cheaper labour in North Korea, and so that's certainly another issue that I am interested in, as much as at least understanding some of the debates in the context of the Korea-US FTA.
Right. Thank you.
All right.